And we're live.
Hello. Great. Thank you, Benjamin. Welcome to our MTSS Community of Practice. I'm Wendy Hardwick, MTSS Specialist with SPDEG at the OSDE. And today we are overcoming barriers to progress monitoring in MTSS, which goes along with our implementation year 1 course that's on OSDE Connect. Our presenter today is the fabulous Racheal Becker. She is the other MTSS specialist with SPDEG. Racheal works with districts on implementing MTSS and also with early career special education teachers in an instructional coaching capacity. Welcome, Racheal, and thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Wendy, for that introduction, and Benjamin for helping me get set up over here on the technical side of things. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and hopefully we can get you guys some access to some great tools that will help you as you are implementing progress monitoring. Just a little bit about me. Wendy mentioned that I am one of the MTSS specialists. I am fortunate enough to have worked in other districts in other states where we have been through the process of implementing MTSS and worked through some of the barriers and challenges. And then after years of work, we were able to really see progress for our students. So I'm excited to share some of the resources that we used here with you today. So we are talking about overcoming barriers to academic progress monitoring. This presentation was initially prepared by Kat Merkle and Kyle Allen. Wendy and I worked together to adapt this presentation. So we will go ahead and dive in. So the DBI process is at the heart of everything that we will be discussing today. DBI is a research-based systematic approach for intensifying interventions for students with severe and persistent needs. It integrates 3 core components, which include evidence-based intervention, ongoing assessment, and data-informed adaptation strategies. Progress monitoring is a key piece of this cycle. By the end of this session, participants will be able to understand the role of academic progress monitoring in DBI, create a progress monitoring plan, and understand the available resources from NCII related to progress monitoring. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is progress monitoring. So I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it, but when you hear the term progress monitoring, what comes to mind? If you want to drop a line in the chat, you can, or you can just take a few seconds to think about it and then we'll move on. And then Wendy, if anybody drops anything in the chat, will you let me know?
I will.
Thank you. So progress monitoring is repeated measurement of student performance over the course of the intervention. And then really what we're doing is we're measuring the student's response to the instruction or the intervention to see if what we're doing is working. The goal is to use data to determine in real time whether or not we are being effective and the students achieving what we're hoping they'll achieve from our intervention. So this slide draws on an important distinction that is often confused. Monitoring progress on the left-hand side is informal. It's day-to-day checking for understanding that educators are doing constantly. Progress monitoring, on the other hand, is more formal. It's standardized, valid and reliable, aligned to the target skill. It is also used for identifying students as at risk. Both are valuable, but they serve different purposes. So think about ways that you use progress monitoring in your setting. And if you want to drop it in the chat, you can, or if you just want to think about it on your own or talk about it with maybe a collaborator that's sitting with you, that's great too. Progress monitoring data are powerful because they drive decisions. So progress monitoring data allows us to estimate rates of improvement across time, compare the efficacy of different forms of instruction, identify students who are not demonstrating adequate progress, determine when an instructional change is needed, support communication with parents and students, and support the development of rigorous individualized education program for students with disabilities. Today, we're going to take a closer look at where progress monitoring fits across the full DBI process. This process really starts when students are identified as needing a Tier 2 intervention. You'll notice by looking at the graphic that progress monitoring occurs throughout the cycle, not just at one point. It informs every adaptation decision. So this is the planning framework for the rest of the section or this session. First, we're going to talk about how you will measure progress. You'll need to decide who, when, and how often the data are gathered, what is a meaningful goal, and how you will determine growth. Now, I did have a think, pair, share for this. What challenges do you encounter with progress monitoring? We don't necessarily need to do a think, pair, share, but if you have been progress monitoring or have experiences with that, you could drop it in the chat or talk about it with a collaborator. Okay, if there's nothing in there, we'll keep moving on forward. So the first thing we're going to talk about in this section is the progress monitoring tools. The target behavior is what you're actually trying to measure. It must connect directly to the student's intervention goal. There must be alignment between the target skill, the instructional tool, and the progress monitoring tool. For example, if we are working on reading fluency, the intervention you should be using should address the reading fluency, and then the progress monitoring measure should align with that intervention. Misalignment between the target behavior and the tool is one of the most common errors in progress monitoring. So one of the common challenges that we find is misalignment between the assessment and the tool and the intervention content. So they may have a tool that's too easy or it's too hard for the student to use. Practical solution is to clearly define what you're measuring and match the tool to both the skill and the student's instructional level. So in this resource, which you guys will have access to this presentation, but in this resource, they actually outline different tools that you can use to target specific skills. And then it helps you match the tool with the deficit as well as the skill that you are trying to target. But it's a great tool and it helps sort of walk you through that process. So what to look for in a progress monitoring measure. So you want to make sure that your progress monitoring measure is brief and easy to administer, realistically feasible in the classroom. We want to make sure that it can be used repeatedly. Alternate forms should be available, otherwise students will just memorize the probe. So it's important that if you are using something for progress monitoring that you have a lot of different versions. That way the students aren't just memorizing. The tool needs to be valid and reliable, meaning backed by research, and sensitive to growth, meaning able to detect small changes in the student's performance over time. So for example, if you have a student that is targeting letter naming fluency as their skill, you want to make sure that the measure you're choosing is sensitive to pick up progress in that area. So you wouldn't want to do a full reading probe just to measure letter naming fluency. That's just one example. So another common barrier is collecting data that isn't truly valid or reliable. This can happen when administration conditions vary or when tools aren't used as intended. NCII has a great resource to help you select not only academic screening tools, but this particular link actually links to screening tools, progress monitoring measures, as well as intervention tools. And then it will tell you the reliability in the research that is linked to these specific tools. So it's a really great tool, and I would encourage you to spend a little time looking through this. It's really useful. So the next component is planning to gather progress monitoring data. So we know what tools to look for. Now we're going to talk about how to plan the logistics of the data collection, which can be challenging. There's a lot of moving parts. So these guiding questions should be answered before data collection begins. We want to know who collects the data and who enters the data, who ensures that the data are collected and entered with fidelity, how are data collected and entered, how frequently does the data collection and entry need to occur, and when are data collected and entered. You don't want to wait to figure these answers out on the fly. Teams need to work together to figure out who is going to do what, and NCII has some great tools to help with this as well. These are some practical real-world solutions for fitting progress monitoring into a busy school day. So the first one is gather progress monitoring data on 1 to 2 students at the end of an intervention. The gen ed teacher can gather data on 1 to 2 students per day. You could monitor on alternative weeks, 3 students 1 week, 3 students the next week. Use advisory or homeroom periods to collect data, or use non-teacher staff to progress monitoring students. You just want to make sure that as part of your progress monitoring plan that you are training these people on how to progress monitor, but we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to fidelity. There is no single approach that works for every school, but flexibility and consistency are essential. Another common challenge is that we might struggle to collect data frequently enough to make timely instructional decisions. For academic progress monitoring, weekly data collection is the standard recommendation. However, as the intervention is intensified, this may need to be increased. We have access to a really useful intervention planning document, which this links directly to. This is one of my favorite tools of NCII's because it really just walks teams through each component of the intervention process, and it just helps you to make sure that you're addressing all of the things that you need to make sure you can do the intervention with fidelity. So that brings me into the topic of fidelity. Fidelity of data collection is just as important as the data itself. Incomplete data does not help us to make decisions. So we want to make sure that we are not inconsistent with administration. Oftentimes there are errors in scoring and there are issues with data entry. So what we need to do is make sure that we are properly training our are people who are implementing our interventions and our progress monitoring. We want to follow any manuals that are provided, and then do fidelity checks as part of the planning. So one practical solution, and this is a nice resource that NCII offers. It is the Fidelity of Implementation Assessment and Data Entry Procedure. It's a great tool to help teams ensure that fidelity of assessments are happening, and then to pinpoint what training adjustments might need to happen, or system adjustments that need to be done to make sure that everything is happening the way it is intended to within the intervention and the progress monitoring piece. Setting goals and graphing academic progress. So once you are collecting targeted quality data, the next step is to set meaningful goals and graphing data so that you can actually use it. So goal setting involves 3 steps. You want to establish the baseline. That's where the student is starting from. Choose a goal setting strategy. There are multiple valid approaches. And then, of course, write a measurable goal, because vague goals don't drive decisions. So this is another great resource. I love this resource, but it really dives into helping districts and teams develop proper goals for their students. So I'm not going to go over this entire document, but I'll just summarize it. So the first section talks about benchmark goals. So they're aiming for the grade level expectation. This typically works when students are close to grade level, but it can be unrealistic for students who are significantly behind. The second goal setting strategy is the rate of improvement, or ROI is what it's referred to sometimes. This uses typical weekly growth, where you take the student's baseline and project growth over time. This helps set goals that are realistic but still ambitious and looking to close that achievement gap. The third goal setting option or goal setting strategy is the intra-individual approach. Now, this is based on the student's own growth rate, where you're looking at their current rate of growth, and then working to increase and accelerate process. This is really intended for students who are already identified as special ed, typically, and are significantly behind, but it is a way to track growth for those students. Excuse me. So this is a sample of some graph data of an oral reading fluency. So over here on this axis, on the y-axis, we have the words correct per minute. And then this is the x-axis, which is the date of administration. These probes are being administered, it looks like, weekly. This green line is the goal line. And so it looks like, as of now, the student is above the goal line, which we'll talk more about on the next slide. We definitely want to use graphs because it does make the data patterns visible in a way that tables alone cannot. And having the graphs available, while it is an extra step and can be somewhat overwhelming to, at first, it really does take the guesswork out of making decisions on interventions for students. So again, we have another graph where we have graphed the students' data. So some things that you'll notice, the baseline data is where the student started. The phase line tells us when the intervention started, and then they've collected the data pieces. After they started the intervention, it looks like they're entering it weekly. We have the goal line in green, and then the trend line here in this red color. So at this point, is the student on track to meet the goal based on this trend? No, they're not. So these graphs are important because, like I said, it takes the guesswork out of this decision making, because we've all sat in data meetings where we might be looking at the data and we're like, I think he's making progress, but we're not sure if the rate. This really helps us to close that gap and to really make data-based decisions instead of having to guess. A lot of the assessment programs have built-in graphing components, but luckily NCII does have a resource if you are using progress monitoring tools that do not have the graphing component built in, and we'll look at those in the coming slides. So as I mentioned before, a lot of programs have built-in graphing components, and graphing by hand can be very time consuming. And as we all know, time is super limited in schools. So this is a great tool. If you follow this link, it will actually take you to a video where they walk you through the process of how to enter the data and how to determine what you want to use for if you're going to use the benchmark or if you're going to use the student's rate of improvement. It will walk you through that entire process. So I would highly encourage you to go ahead and check that resource out. And then you can literally download the Excel spreadsheet onto your computer and just use it and adapt it to your needs. So this is a resource. Oh, this is just another slide that links to the same resource. The next thing we're going to talk about is decision rules for academic progress monitoring. Now that we know how to collect and graph data, let's talk about how to interpret it and to make decisions. When reviewing a student's graph, there are three possible conclusions. Number one, are they making a positive response? Is the student on track? If this is the case, then we want to consider fading supports or increasing the goal. Number two, if there is a poor response, the current intervention is insufficient. Begin the DBI adaptation process. I also want to emphasize that it's important that the decision rules are applied consistently. And then if the data is unclear, we want to check fidelity. So one of the common challenges is that decisions are not made consistently. So we'll graph the data, but we're not sure exactly what it means when we're looking at the graphs or how to interpret it. So once we set the goal, we need to make sure we have a clear way to decide if the intervention is working. There are three common ways to analyze progress monitoring data. And this is another great resource that really dives into explaining the different types of decision rules. So the first one goes into the 4-point analysis. This is the quickest method. You look at the last 4 points of data. If all 4 points are above the goal line, then you increase the goal. If all 4 points are below, then you would adjust the intervention. If it's mixed, then we keep collecting data. This is great for quick decisions, but it can be influenced by outliers. So that's just something to keep in mind. But this is one of the easiest ones and pretty common. Another thing you can use is trend line analysis. So this looks at the overall pattern of growth over time. You compare the trend line to the goal line. If the trend is steeper, the student is exceeding expectations. If it's flatter, then the growth is not sufficient, so you would adjust the instruction. If they match, then you continue the plan. This is an accurate method, but it requires quite a bit of data. And then the median of the last 3 data points, this one helps to reduce the impact of outliers. So you would take the last 3 data points and find the median. If it's above the goal line, you would increase the goal. If it's below, you would adjust the intervention. If it's on track, then you would continue. All 3 methods will lead to the same decision: adjust, continue, or increase. The goal is not just to collect the data, it's to use it to make timely instructional decisions. And this particular resource goes into a lot more detail, which Wendy, it looks like she's putting all those in the chat. But these go into a lot more detail on when you should select which ones. But I think it's a really helpful resource. So hopefully you guys will find it helpful too. This is another link to the resource. You can just use the QR code. But it demonstrates how to use these decision rules. In summary, the DBI process, progress monitoring, is an important step in determining whether an intervention is working for an individual student. A progress monitoring plan needs to answer 4 key questions. How will you measure the progress? Who, when, and how often are the data collected? What is the meaningful goal? So what would success look like? And how would you determine growth? It is an ongoing process, and it really is helpful at driving that individualized instruction. Oh, I jumped ahead in my thoughts. It's an ongoing process. If the student is not responsive, use diagnostic data to develop a hypothesis about why the student has not yet made adequate progress, and then start the process again. So DBI, progress monitoring, is at the heart of the DBI process. And then this is another great resource. NCII has access to the academic progress monitoring self-paced modules. So if you really want to deep dive into this, or you still have questions, definitely check out their resources, because they're just great and pretty user-friendly. All right, Wendy, that is all I have for today. Do we want to look through some of the resources in more detail, or do we want to just take questions? What do you think makes sense at this point?
If anybody has any questions, I feel like go ahead and put them in the chat. I did put the link to the intensive intervention website, and then also the link to the progress monitoring part in particular. That's where they can find all the resources that we discussed in this module. I appreciate you going through it. I know that progress monitoring is one of those things that can be intimidating sometimes, because we feel like when we're collecting data, that can be really time consuming, and being able to figure out times when we can do it and who can do it and the way we can do it. But the nice thing about NCII is they've put together these tools that really show us step by step how we can overcome those barriers. And so I appreciate you going through those with us. And if anybody has any questions after we end this presentation, feel free to email SPDEG at any time, and our presentation will be put on the SPDEG link tree, which if Benjamin, if you don't mind adding that to the chat so everybody has access to that. Our link tree is where you'll find all of our additional sources on MTSS implementation. We have our summer conference coming up. That registration is being released, so keep an eye out for that. And join us next month at the same time on April 29th for Fidelity in implementation. So we're coming towards the end of our course. If you're taking the course with us, we're coming into the last couple of modules. So this next one will be on the Fidelity, and then we're going to be looking at rollout plans. So if you have any questions, let us know. Otherwise, we'll see you next month. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Racheal.
And thank you guys for coming.